skipping the Simply Sustain introduction, going to the question of the solid waste that is left after people sell, the producers sell their products and consumers use them. So the question really is, who's responsible? Is it? Who is responsible for the waste anyway? I think today there was an announcement by people who found in the Atlantic Ocean an enormous, which is called a gyre, an enormous quantity of plastic waste, not just plastic, but a whole lot of forks, knives, things that float on the ocean, almost the size of the Pacific Gyre. So the question is, who's responsible for that? Consumers? Are we responsible? We're the ones having used it. The municipalities and the governments who have the responsibility to make sure that that is properly dealt with? Or is it the producers? Or is it all of the above? Well, turns out regulators in many countries are quite clear, having thought about this, and these regulators, particularly in the European countries, have had a long time, and they've come up with a regulation that's called Extended Producer Responsibility. And it started with e-waste, electronic waste, but it's now spreading rapidly to packaging waste. And they're quite clear, and they said, you know, it really is the brand owner, even though in a product, you know, like a potato chips and potato chip bag, there may be a whole chain of producers. The plastic maker, the bag maker, and the potato chip maker, and finally the brand owner. The European regulation and also the EPR regulations, which are going beyond Europe, have made it very clear that the responsibility lies with the brand that is on the packaging, because they ultimately can control the fate of that packaging. And what is also useful, though it may seem like a daunting task to have the responsibility, what is also useful is to understand that EPR defines 4 kinds of responsibility, that the brand owners are liable, they have a liability if there is an environmental damage, and says they have a financial responsibility, and which should go towards, so brand owners should cover all or part of the cost of the collection, recycling, and disposal, and a physical responsibility. So they can either pay for it, but make sure that it's physically taken care of. And lastly, the information responsibility. And that means that all information that people need to deal with this waste is provided to all those who are concerned with dealing with the waste. So that's really the 4 types of responsibility the EPR regulation has set out. And as I said, it's moving from e-waste to consumer packaging very rapidly. And the next slide shows, you can't see it very well, but you can read it, I hope, the countries that are already applying and enforcing the extended producer responsibility. In the U.S., the state of Vermont has proposed recently, and California, but in Canada, Ontario, and I think a couple of other regions have started to enforce extended producer responsibility, these regulations for the packaging, post-consumer packaging waste. So the law is quite clear. Okay, the law is one thing, but really, what are the other key stakeholders saying about this? We recently did a study for a major brand, and we did several stakeholder interviews, and almost all of them quite strongly said, yes, the brand owners should be responsible, but what was useful is they also said, look, there's also a strong business case for the brand owners to take this responsibility. because what it really does is protects the brand image. Because when this branded packaging lies around, everybody can read whose packaging it is. It's a litter. And if you take care of that, you have customer loyalty. So there's a very strong business case for making sure that it doesn't end up everywhere. And it reduces costs, and it reduces the supply risks, etc., etc. They also said that they should take both the financial responsibility as well as give the information, because when you look at the various locations around the US, the discussions about what is the best way to deal with some of this packaging. Is recycling the best? Is incineration the best? Should you burn it and get back energy, or should you bury it? What is the best from an environmental point of view? What is the best thing to do? Well, the people who have that information and the knowledge are the brand owners. So that information, the stakeholders felt, should be provided to the relevant people. And the last point was a very strong one, where they said, saying on the packaging it's recyclable is not enough. It doesn't mean anything anymore. But really, producers should make sure that the packaging is recycled, which means that they take the responsibility for the infrastructure, for collection, transportation, and taking it to the final point of treatment. But they, at the same token, they also said, I don't think producers should take the responsibility for the entire chain all alone. And they did say, well, look, if a single company felt, or a single brand owner voluntarily, in the absence of any regulation, voluntarily said, we're going to do something about it, they won't succeed, because the task is too big and too enormous. So they were really giving examples of where companies had gone out on their own and did the work and failed. So the suggestion was also to collaborate in some way with other brand owners or others who have a similar kind of a problem or an issue. So that was what we found through our research on both the regulations and the stakeholder interviews. So the question really, which I would like to help address, give some advice and guidance to people, is, given these trends, how can brand owners, consumer product groups, prepare and strategize to meet these changing regulations? And how would they know when it's to their benefit to collaborate and when to go alone? And I hope to provide some guidelines. So the first advice I'd give to people is to really I think the time has come for brands to take a much broader view of the impact of their brand and their products. Much broader view and much more rigorous view than to look at the influences, the impact of their products on society and environment, as rigorously as they now look at the influences on their product. So in other words, if you now look at any brand, everybody looks at the consumer trends, the environmental impacts, and they say, well, how does that impact our brand? What should we be doing? What innovation should we be taking? So they're looking at the impact on them, so they should look equally at the impact of their products on the outside environment. That's step one. And so that, I think, is a pretty fundamental change. Being a brand doesn't mean, just looking at consumer needs and saying, let's go and meet them, but we should also be aware of the impact of the brand on the outside society and environment. The second guidance is, when you are looking, look at the environmental and social footprint beyond just the traditional boundary. Well, what do I mean by the traditional boundary? I think most brands, I would say almost all brands, are quite responsible insofar as looking at the impact of the products that they make and at the point of sale, and they'll go as far as use.